Hello, I'm now coming out of the few moments of panic, always when I see how few people there are at the very beginning, because you know so well how to time yourselves. And this is a different time from classes. If it stays small, I'd be fine. Well, I'll wait and see. Possibly if there are questions, I'll notice them if they're in the chat, and you might be able to unmute and interrupt. Let me situate you and myself in what we're doing, because I'm thinking that for the art in Paris in the second half of the 19th century, you would not expect to be looking first at such a gormless looking structure as this. This is actually the exhibition hall where in Paris in the second half of the 19th century, the major annual exhibitions of art were held. So I'll just leave that on as the backdrop for a moment. This is the second in what I had envisioned as a three-part series to cover the art from 1850 to 1900, devoting so much time to that place and that time, because it's generally accepted, at least in the visual arts, that that's where modern art began. It's very specific sort of artistic situation, political situation, social situation that led to it. And today there'll be a considerable review of what that last series way before Christmas covered, because we're going to be, I'm struggling with this, looking at so many things that are going on at the same time that are so disparate, how to do them in a lecture that's a thread that passes through time, when these are instead things that should be seen side by side. So I want to talk about sort of the situation of the arts as a review, and then primarily this series will be dealing with the time of the emergence of the Impressionist movement, which for many people, especially Americans, sort of characterizes the second half of the 19th century. So I want to start, first of all, why is this modern art started in Paris? One of it has to do with the very particular circumstances of painting, to a lesser degree, sculpture in France, which sets it apart from, say, certainly the US, England, Germany, Italy, Spain. That was that in France, there was just a complete governmental involvement in the arts. That goes way back to the time of Louis XIV, when he built the palace at Versailles. He wanted that extraordinarily enormous building to have a kind of uniform decorative tone inside. So he established a school of painting and chose teachers, set up a kind of rigorous training session so that there would be people equipped to carry out this grandiose project. And from that time on, the French government always made use of painting for its own political purposes. After the French Revolution in the 18th century, religious art was less important. It was not so much the Catholic Church that was using it, as much as it was the state, both to educate people, to decorate government buildings, to fill a series of provincial museums, to sort of set the stage for the culture. And one of the things that, one of the ways that the French government did this was that there was a centralized art instruction at the highest level in Paris called the École des Beaux-Arts. Only the very best chosen teachers taught there. And students very much wanted to go there. And not only did they want to go there, but then they wanted to show their works in the annual exhibition sponsored by the government, full of people from the École des Beaux-Arts as teachers, now acting as judges for what was in the show. And it was at these exhibitions, let's go to still a rather grim looking image. At these exhibitions that people, the Parisian public would, and people came from outside Paris too, would see what the good art was, what was available, what artists were in, what was possible to buy, what was possible to want something similar. So this is the way the well-trained artists found a public. There were only a few rudimentary galleries at that time forming, and there was nothing like the sort of gallery going that there might be now. If you knew of an artist, you knew an artist. If you had some in, you might be able to get an invitation to visit their studio and to see what was going on. But the salons and the school had a chokehold on the connection between the aspiring artists and the available buying public. Now, I guess, let's see, maybe I can have one more that's a little nicer to look at. Well, at least it's more amusing to look at. The process that happened was that these salon exhibitions were sometime late spring, early summer every year. And they were the social event in Paris. The Parisian fashion houses put out their new clothing, their most fashionable clothing, time with this, so that you would be at your best dressed going to especially the opening of these exhibitions. It was like a Met Gala. Now, artists who wanted to have their works there had to submit paintings. And these are two wonderful, I think, wonderful caricatures that were in a caricature magazine by the artist Daumier. These are from the 50s, early 60s, of artists coming, the aspiring stars. So this one is called the Triumphant March. So here you see the artist with two small canvases, and then he's hired people to carry several larger ones, because there's a good reason for making paintings that were very large. Well, that was speculative and expensive to do that, because if it's in, it's going to take up more space, it's going to get more attention. So here comes the artist. He's sure his works are going to please the judges. They're shoe-ins, they're going to be on the walls, they're going to be sold. They're sold. He might even win a prize. If he wins a prize, he never has to go through the jury again. He can always show, and he's guaranteed to sell. So here he goes in, triumphant. And then there's the funeral march. Here he leaves dejected. None of his paintings, so he says, refused, 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 refused. The judges for these shows, these exhibitions have been going on for a long time before the second half of the 19th century. And there had been some attempts at trying to democratize it slightly in terms of the judges. But there were some who would be government officials, some from the École des Beaux-Arts, and this is like the one that really affected matters, artists whose works had previously won prizes at the Salon. So it's prize winners choosing essentially their successors. That does not encourage innovation and variety, because of course, they're biased toward what they themselves have done. So it was a very conservative institution. So that's one matter. And then another matter was just the sheer number of people who wanted to become artists. Here, I'll give you several more. This is a black and white reproduction of an actual painting of one opening night at a salon. This is from around 1900. There would be paintings and sculpture, also etchings and prints of various kinds. So here you see, you get the sense it's an occasion where you look and you expect to be looked at. And here from toward the end of the century, a painter painting which represents the time of judging. The judges had to go through literally thousands of paintings within 2 days. So that was made judging more capricious. There's not enough time for reflection. And then there was something else, which was that the judges never told you why something was accepted or rejected. And they went painting by painting rather than artist by artist. So an artist might have painting X accepted, painting Y rejected, 1 painting out of 5 accepted, 3 out of 3 accepted. So there was this extraordinary uncertainty at all of this. So it was a really a wretched situation. This painting includes images that are, I guess, all recognizable or almost all recognizable as prominent painters of the day who had been chosen as judges. And one of them, I can't see, but I think is over in here because part of that screen is covered for me, is an artist whose work we're going to be looking at. But this was a really feverish, terribly important event. And then when the paintings were chosen, as you saw, they were arranged. They crammed as many works into the space as was available. And the paintings are what is called skied. They went literally from ceiling to almost to the floor. And most of the time they were arranged by alphabetical order in the name of the artist. One thing that would help the hapless viewer who came to this is that you would get a little, well, I can't see it there, but we'll see it later on, a little booklet that would, oh, here, he has this little booklet. And there would be the number. So the paintings were numbered, say, okay, that's by so-and-so, and this is a subject. And here you are looking again at another Daumier cartoon. This is from an exhibition in the 60s, I believe it was. See, an aspect of the salon on the opening day. That is the day when you went to see and be seen, and where literally there were thousands of people who would come. Here, this is nothing but the true connoisseurs, a total of 60,000 people. Well, there were 60,000 who went that one day. Now, it was originally for other government functionaries, the social elite who would be in on that day. But here, as Daumier is showing, that these are hardly all the social elite, and they're of all ages, and there are even women in here. And this is a workman's cap. These are ordinary gentlemen, some frowning in great disdain. Here, some looking at the back. So it's a whole cross-section of humanity. Critics would come, and like the caricaturists, their work would be published in local newspapers so that people who were not able to attend would get reviews and would get caricatured images of what it was like in there. So that's the situation for the artist in Paris. When I said before there were many artists coming to Paris, Paris itself between 1850 and about 1880 or so doubled in size, the population. And the whole city was being rebuilt with the grand avenues we know now. That's when they were going in. An enormous social disruption of slum clearance and people being moved out of the center of town. But now there were trains and buses, so people could get to the city. There was more industry. There were new jobs. People were rushing in from the country. The city urban life was now a great appeal. And as there was a growing middle class in this world of more business and commerce, there were more youngsters who weren't needed, young men especially, working at home, in the fields or in their small towns, who, if they had dreams, could dream of coming to Paris to become a painter. This is the name of, people who took the last series will be familiar with this artist, the name of one of the artists who did come like that and found tremendous success. Bouguereau, a name who in the 20th century and the 21st century means virtually nothing. He came, he won a prize, the best prize offered in the Salon exhibitions, which was to have a scholarship to go to study in Paris for 3 years. Or if you won the Prix de Rome, I mean, you were guaranteed a cushy life from thenceforth, because you were the best. So he was a judge in the Salon. Here he is. And he, like many well-regarded, well-known artists, also had an income from setting up their own ateliers, where they would take young students, hire models, and come around and more or less critique the students' works. And so here's Bouguereau with some of these many young men who are, this is about 1880, rushing into the city to find their fortunes. He also, well, he was quite enlightened. He also taught women. Once France allowed public education for women, which was in 1880. Well, what Bouguereau is this artist who practically chortled at his work, not in glee that it's the best, but he had the same kind of passion for painting that Matisse did, that he lived to paint. He loved to paint. Every morning he got up, eager to go paint. And there are at least 800 and some paintings of his that are known. They're seldom shown nowadays because he is so out of style. But in his day, as one American art dealer said, almost no American who collected art could consider himself a serious collector unless he owned a Bouguereau. And here's a Bouguereau. This is a Pietà. So this is one of the waningly popular subjects, religious subjects in art. I think it's kind of hard to look at now. And this is from the 1870s. Now that's the 1870s. In 1874 was the first Impressionist exhibition. So this is exactly of that same time. This therefore represents the official, sanctioned, adored, expensive art at the time of the Impressionists. What would make it adored? Well, it is conservative in the sense, and take this in meaning a positive sense, that it preserves the values of the past, that it maintains the best of the past, not only in terms of maintaining the Catholic faith, but in this one, and it was to be recognized by people who had some familiarity with the arts, it maintained and referred, and with great deference, to the art of the past. To here, it'd be Michelangelo's Pietà. As you see, with the slumping arm, the rather slender legs, there's nothing I can do about this sound. I hope it's not bothering you in the background from my phone. And then it's been updated into almost a photorealist, very obvious, adoring set of angels, always done in a quite ideal form. The tenor, the tone, the sources of this leave nothing for you to puzzle about. It's very obvious. But what else can you admire about this? Oh, it is impeccably painted. It is unbelievably realistic, almost photorealistic. Bouguereau was famous for painting flesh. He knew human anatomy. He had studied, of course, he knew the body. They'd done dissections. And he did very careful drawings. The colors are carefully chosen. It's very well thought out. So there's thought, reference to the past, marvelous technique. If your sense of marvelous technique is you can't see that the artist did it. Or this one also from the 1870s. This one is called just the Nymphs and Satyr. And then there was something by a kind of an obscure poet alongside it. And this was in the Salon of 1873, so the year before the first Impressionist show, the year when the artists who we know as Impressionists were getting turned down left and right from being shown at the Salon. And this is in the Clark Institute in Williamsburg. When it was shown in the Salon, one of the critics says, this is without a doubt the finest painting of our generation. So you have that reference to classical antiquity. You have nudes who are obviously idealized nudes and idealized on the form of the Greek sculptural Venus types with high, round, relatively small breasts and narrow waists and large behinds. Big, that's just their standard of beauty. Or this one, which is in the Met, a Breton girl and child. He had gone to Brittany and made some sketches from the life there. Then he would come back to the studio and do it. So it's also peasant life of the time, but they're quaint. Is there labor? Well, only that you can see that she's barefoot. Maybe that's just doesn't mean labor, but possibly poverty, but nothing else that suggests poverty there. The sweet, friendly, lovely, rosy-cheeked child, and such a deferential head down, looking at us expression of the older sister, very young mother, seen here. Now, that's the last Bouguereau I'm going to show you, but I want to make sure that you had these two quotes from him. Because remember, he's not only a painter, he's a great teacher. I mean, great in the sense he had many, many teachers, students, and he was a good teacher, and that he was a judge. Here, he says, for me, a work of art should be a heightened interpretation of nature. The quest for the ideal has been the purpose of my life. One has to seek beauty and truth. There's only one kind of painting. It's the painting that presents to the eye with perfection, the kind of beautiful and impeccable enamel you find in Veronese or Titian. So it is very clear his standards are to present an art of something toward which you aspire, toward which you long, a dream of a perfectible world, not the chaos of current Paris as it's being rebuilt, although it was very prosperous at this time. None of the recent social disruption, it takes you into this other preferred world. And I will say now, before we get to Impressionism, I think for a lot of people, of course, I'm going to keep myself out of this if I can. That's how they view Impressionism. That it's a wonderful, beautiful world, a kind of a delightful world, an escape from present reality. Well, here's one other thing Bouguereau had to say, and he said it especially about Impressionism. I'm very eclectic, as you see. Well, you're not seeing anything in here that suggests he's eclectic, except that he does a variety of subjects. I accept and respect all schools of painting, which have as a basis of their doctrine the sincere study of nature and the search for the true and beautiful. As for the Impressionists and the Pointillists, I cannot discuss them. I do not see the way they say or claim to see. That's the only reason for my negative opinion about them. He was adamant. He would not allow, he always voted down any Impressionist artist's submission for the Salon. And then around 1900, that we have a quote from someone who heard a conversation between Monet and Degas. They're talking about, oh, who's going to be the famous artist? And they plucked out of the year 2000. And they said, oh, it'll be Bouguereau. Now, it's not exactly clear if they were, in saying that, despairing about the public, that this Bouguereau they disliked as much as they even had, Degas had a word, Bougereauté instead of beauté for what Bouguereau did. They despaired and disparaged about the people that liked this. But so Bouguereau is very much part of the dialogue from this time. And for a slightly different reason, I want to show you works by, just a little bit, by his wife, who was American born, from New England, New Hampshire. And here you see her, late in her career. A painting by hers that's in the National Museum of Women in the Arts, David the Shepherd. She was very, so she, when she was young, actually quite young and very intrepid for Americans of that time, especially female Americans. She went to Paris in 1864. It wasn't yet common for women to go to travel. She had to have a female companion, but even to be able to study art there. She thought she could get into an academy, where she was not allowed. But fortunately, she'd been sick, so her hair was short, and then she dressed like a boy. And then where could she learn to paint? She went to this school of Gobelin's tapestries, where anyone who's going to be a weaver had to learn about art. So she circumvented the educational system. And then once it was possible to study, she studied with Bouguereau and ultimately married him. She was his second wife. And she was very forthright, saying, oh, I'd rather be a second-rate Bouguereau than anybody else. And she won great prizes. She had a role in it, sort of introducing many Americans to what was going on in French artistic studios, because they would come visit her when she came to Paris, and then she would take them around. Mary Cassatt will be the same way. So she's a pioneer. And she was very unusual to be able to do a religious work. She's, oh, this is probably, who's going to buy this? Maybe a religious institution would. More common would she would do something like this, which again looks like a peasant scene. It's just called Confidence. These two girls sharing a secret. There's again that beautiful, idyllic, country, timeless scene. So there could be, those are called a genre scene. It was a scene of everyday life, but it was one that had a kind of a theme. It wasn't just life being lived. And you know, Bouguereau himself is not going to show just life being lived. So that means that there's not going to be much of that in the salon. However, this is a painting from toward the end of the 19th century by an artist you will see more of later. Always, I put him up as a foil, as the bad artist against the good artists, although he is much admired in his day. This is again a scene at one of the salons from the 1880s, where the paintings are crammed in. There would be portraits, there would be some religious scenes, there would be scenes from history or from classical mythology, and a new subject had also become very popular, and were landscapes. And that's, so here. A landscape artist who was also significant because he will in turn teach one of the Impressionists. You have this very large painting by him of Hagar and the wilderness in the mat. This was the most time-honored way to represent a landscape, which was to populate it with some meaningful human story. That landscape in and of itself was not considered as being sufficient. It wasn't sufficiently instructive. As all paintings, you know, this what I'm talking about, all of these. Do you hear me talking about style? Well, a little bit. But it's subject matter that matters very, very much, because art is still to teach. That's one reason the government is sponsoring it. It's not just for decoration and private houses. This is to set the tone, the cultural tone for the society. Well, anyway, Corot takes bits of real landscape that he's seen, and then here he is transposing them into the Middle Eastern landscape, an oak tree right here. But so this was one in the salon, and he had a number of works in the salon, and there were also some that were just straight landscapes. I have to show you one more here. I didn't like this one. This was in the salon, and this was done in the 1870s. He did later ones that were sort of dreamy, more idealized, subdued hued mood images. But his importance for, and that's what was liked in his day, and that was universally enjoyed. But it was also putting him in as a representative of a whole group of artists who began to go out to the forest at Fontainebleau, 20, 30 miles from Paris. And instead of painting always just in the studio, painted from the life. And this is a fairly small image he did of part of the forest of Fontainebleau and the sand and the sun in the midday. This is, let's see if I can give you the date for this one. Date doesn't really matter a lot, but 1840. So this is already long before the Impressionists. But he will, as I say, teach an Impressionist art. He will also, because he earned a great deal of money with his landscapes, because they were, could be enjoyed by everybody, especially city people who wanted something other, a kind of a visual escape, or to go to Fontainebleau themselves. So he's helped to support some young artists. He's a very generous man that way. And here you see him working outdoors. One of the things making that possible was that there were now portable easels and paints in tubes that were easy to carry. So you could take your supplies. You didn't need to deal with all the muss and fuss that you could handle in the studio. Now, these are artists who, in their lifetimes, span what we're going to be concentrating on. Rosa Bonheur, there was who's photograph of her you see here. She was the subject of her first retrospective at the Musée d'Orsay. It just closed at the middle of July. Extraordinary woman. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good reproduction of this, but this is her self-portrait. Look at this. Who would expect a self-portrait of someone with her hand over the back of the cattle? At the Met, you also have actually her most famous painting, The Horse Fair. And this, I know you remember this. You've seen it, the size is 16 feet long. And this was done just shortly after 1850. Her paintings, she was one of the richest artists of the 19th century. She earned exorbitant sums for her works, although she's a woman and she's doing this. But her subject matter was able to just move outside this whole category as, is this ennobling, uplifting? It's animals. It was an almost everywhere automatically enjoyed subject that didn't carry any potentially explosive content to it. It was perhaps explosive that it was a woman doing this, but she led a life completely unlike anyone else. Maybe she came from a family. Her father was from a kind of I wouldn't say it's a cult, but a philosophical school that thought all people were equal to this sexual equality, political equality, social equality. And he also trained, all his children worked in animal arts, but she was especially talented. And she had worked in the salon year after year. She won the prizes, top prizes. At the end of her life, she got the Legion of Honor. I mean, she's not like anyone else. And this painting, she worked with one dealer and she sent it out. It was shown in New York. It was shown in London. Queen Victoria saw it, was so impressed with it. She invited Rosa Bonheur to come visit her. So she's wow. And just before 1850, she had done this painting. It's about 8 feet long, of plowing in sort of central France. The fall plowing, these great oxen plodding toward us, they're far more important than the human figures. There were some critics who looked at this too realistic. Now, photography was just developing at this time in popularity, and this just had too much the quality of being like a literally realistic image as might be seen in a photograph. But actually, the cattle, the landscape, there's a quality of idealizing in all of this. This was bought by the government and put in a government museum. But this does also represent what was an alternate wave in art that starts right around this time, around 1850. And that's the emergence of realism as a movement, rather than this classicizing, idealizing mode, which we look at up until now, which sometimes just goes by the term academic art. That's a real put down, but it was the French Academy that liked it. Here are just two more by her. In her fortune, she got a great estate on the edge of Fontainebleau. She had her pet lion, you see here. All kinds of animals. And then a figure who's just as much a character as she is, and in a way more consequential because what he did had a more profound effect on everyone else. And that's Gustave Courbet, who from his pose even here, I think you have a sense of is the man who is aware of his own worth. And he even said he was the most arrogant man of his day, who came from, not from Paris itself, but over along the French-Swiss border. He was very proud of being a member of peasant culture rather than an urban culture. But he came to Paris and he did show works in the salon. Once he had won a prize winner, then even though people blenched when they saw what he did, it had to be accepted. And this was one, the Stonebreakers. It's a painting that's been it's destroyed in World War II. But if you think of what I said about the noble, the beautiful, what you aspire to, or just even, oh, those interesting animals, or the lovely landscapes you can escape to, then you put up against them impoverished peasants of just the kind that you see in the countryside in France now that you might want to not be aware of, the ones who are a threat to the urban society in the revolution or the uprising of 1848, and they were being shown at life size. These figures whom Courbet said he saw in the life, and then he represents them with this back-breaking, grinding poverty for a man too old and a child too young doing it, shown with every patch, every indignity. The figures themselves, you have the sense they're somewhat heroic, but you go to the salon, you go on your opening night in your latest couturier outfit with your husband, or if you're a member of the demi-monde, with the man who keeps you. You go to see and to be seen, and there on the wall, you see this. Figures, what are you to do with this? Or one thing you do, you keep it at a safe distance by caricaturing it. And this is some drawings and a takeoff on it. Because of course, making fun of something is a very tried and true way to handle something that's discomforting. And then he shows this, the burial at Ornans. He comes from the town of Ornans. And he went to his grandfather's funeral, and these are all people from the town, and they are all recognizable. And this is a very large painting. And this was sent to the salon. So it would take up a lot of wall. Everybody has to look at it. And this is not a national hero's death. This is just a provincial man. Or here, it doesn't even say who it's going to be. And the grave, moreover than that, do you see heroics? Well, there's some women crying, but there's nothing heroic about that. The grave is even turned so it would come out into our space. Oh, the acolyte, he's not quite sure what to do. The dog's, it's kind of interesting what's going on here. So this has that same kind of quality of incredible realism. Oh, where's the fine technique? Oh, not here. Ugly, ill-painted. Courbet is insisting that people of them who are peasants, who have been peasants, are just as worthy of respect as anyone else. They are also among the heroes of the modern era. Fortunately, he had a fine patron who would support him in his endeavors. So he also did not have to worry about, and a father who would support him. So he could not face the kind of sheer cackling, jeering dismissal that some of the young artists might get if they were working at that. Then he does this in the 1850s, the artist's studio. He painted this in 6 weeks. Well, since he'd been a prize winner at one of the salons, this was to be admitted to the salon. And also there was actually another place where works could be shown about once every 10 years. There was an international exhibition. Courbet had a lot of works accepted in it, but this one wasn't. And possibly it's because it was too big. Here he is. He's actually painting a landscape at the very center of this large painting. Oh, I'm going to go by that. We'll come back to that later. So now, what does Courbet is something new? Precluded from putting this in the exposition hall. He wants everyone to see it. He wrote a pamphlet about this. He's a relentless publicist for his art. So he had an exhibition hall built right next to the official one. That man who was shown in the previous one, who was his patron, helped pay for it. And it was a brick and mortar structure. And he showed something of 40 of his own paintings in here. And that is what is new. An artist has taken charge of how his work is shown. He didn't even just rent the space, but he built his own space next to the exposition hall. Some of his paintings were still in the exposition hall as well. There are more works by Courbet than any other artist in this 1855 show. But that opens the way for the future, for artists to begin to think, I don't need to make my way through this agony if I can find a way to exhibit independently. And there are several dealers who begin to host small exhibitions in their galleries too. And he has another exhibition later on, and you can see he has no trouble with his proclaiming his worth. So he becomes a dominant figure among young artists, that he's just not only in the strength and vividness of the character, but what he's willing to paint. One of his sayings is, he would paint anything you can see. He'd paint an angel if you show him them. But he said there should be no hierarchy of only the true, the beautiful, the good. Anything that is visible is possible as a subject for a work of art, for a painting. Let's not call it a work of art. So that was a marvelously liberating thought for young painters. Now, it wasn't unique to painting, because this was also happening in literature at the time, that there can be novels, and novels can be about anything, even about low life, any life. It doesn't have to be lessons that we will learn. They can be just illustrations of life as it is. So realism is the wave that comes in 50s, 60s, 70s. And Courbet becomes, well, to his dismay, he becomes very popular. He'd once said, once everybody accepts me, I'm no longer important. But he was important. He did, however, have a great difficulty toward the end of his life. He was exiled from Paris because at the time of an event that I'll talk about again, which was the Franco-Prussian War and the uprising in Paris as a commune in 1870, 1871, Courbet became the artistic director. He never got involved in politics, but he was a great social reformer. He was always calling for recognition, admiration, acceptance of people who were not yet even middle class. But in that, the revolt in 1870-71, this great column, which was in the Place Vendôme, this was a column that was erected to celebrate Napoleon's victories. This was taken down by the mobs, and it was blamed on Courbet as being the ringleader. Well, he wasn't at all a participant, but he certainly was in favor of what they were doing. And as reparations, he was going to be, all his paintings were going to be confiscated, some were destroyed. And he himself then fled to Switzerland. So his last few years were spent in really off the scene. But he was still considered important. Look at these two caricatures, thinking of how influential he was at this. So here's not the Place Vendôme he's doing, but he's tipping over a Parisian urinal. Or here that he's made himself the replacement for Napoleon. So he's powerful. Now, I know here we are at the end, but this, for people who attended the first section, you never saw this. An artist, Henri Regnault, look at his life dates. He dies in the Franco-Prussian War. Here he is as a young man. He came up in the system. He went to the École des Beaux-Arts. He studied with one of the most prominent artists of his day. He won the Prix de Rome, so he had 3 years to work in Rome. But rather than just staying in Rome, he also went to North Africa and Spain. He did some traveling. Well, when you win the Prix de Rome, you every year had to send back specified themed paintings to show you that you weren't wasting your time. And this is one he did. It's a Atamidon is his name. It's with the horses of Achilles. It's a story out of the Trojan War, but a not very well-known one. All Henri had to present was an image of a nude, but he does all of this in addition. And it's a dramatic, it's sort of like a Delacroix. Delacroix just, let's see, by this time, this 1868, Delacroix, I think, died the year before this. Or it's like a Rubens. I mean, it refers to the past in great art. And it shows terrific knowledge of anatomy. And it's full of this great fervor. And then he sends this. This is an absolutely, totally obscure myth. And the title for the painting is called The Execution Without Judgment Under the Moorish King. It's 1870, and it's about 11 feet high. Look at the drama. And look at the color. It's beautiful. The gold, the pink set off here, then the green, and the blood dripping down here. And looking up. Now this is a young man. He's not yet 30, painting like this, with absolute assurance, absolute flair. Fine work, really fine. And it's a sketch. He does this one of a Spanish peasant. And this is just a little small, it's a small drawing. And I believe, yes, in a provincial French museum. And it's sort of based on the kind of work that Velázquez in the 17th century did. So you see, he starts with this really sketchy style, and then he observes the expectation that then the work is more finely finished. And he did this. Now, I hope many of you have seen this. I'm sure anyone who's been to the Met in the 19th century galleries has to have seen this utterly resplendent, very large painting by him called Salome. It started out intentionally as it's just a Moorish girl, but he added a little more on it and put the sword here because just there's nothing especially religious about this. Oh my goodness, look at that. This is very, well, when you go to the museum, you're going to look again. That flickering, quick paint, the way he's just mastered how you could see through that gauzy glitter. A very finely shaped leg. Wonderful showing of bone under skin. And then just wonderful beauty here. You can see the technique. These new colors only come in with a chrome yellow in a special, with new colors of the later 19th century, that they're artificial, chemically made colors. And so these are the colors that are, of course, going to appeal to the Impressionists too, this whole new light palette that was not available before. So in these last few minutes, though, we didn't even get to Monet, but oh well, I will in a moment. So he was still in Rome for on the Prix de Rome when the Franco-Prussian War broke out. There would be no requirement for him to return to fight for France, but he did. And he died in the war. And this was recognized as a great tragedy. Painting world, I think we can say, was a tragedy. Maybe the academic tradition would have flourished into something really wonderful had he been able to continue and people to be influenced by what he did. But this is just one newspaper response to his death, holding him up as a heroizing figure, or a painter of the time shows him here as this quick sketch as dead, which is based on a painting by Monet. Because at this point, we're ready to start Monet. And if we had another hour, that's what we'd do. But so, now you've got realism under your belt. You know that people are expecting the subject matter of painting to have something to tell them. It's not just there as something to fill the canvas. You know there's an expectation for us, among many people, for a very finished kind of impersonal technique in the way things are done. And you know how difficult it was to be an artist. So we're set up to face the work of Monet next hour. And I'm sure, well, I shouldn't say I'm sure of anything, but I imagine at least most of the hour we'll be looking just at works by Monet. And at the moment I will stop. I see there's some chats. You can certainly unmute and take any questions, comments.
The one comment I have was the last painting of Salome.
Yes.
She looks a little bit like Linda Ronstadt. I thought for a minute it was a picture of her.
Well, gorgeous then, gorgeous now.
And then I had a question also about the artist Courbet.
Yeah.
He was painting himself into this one painting where he was painting the landscape. I was wondering how he was able to do that. Paint himself into this huge painting of him painting a landscape.
Well, he would have, he did it. I don't know how many self-portraits there are. He did of himself. I know there are well more than, I think there may be like 8 or 9 of them. So you look in a mirror, and then he can just, because an artist has such wonderful visual memories, and you can just look at a person, so you can imagine yourself in that position, and then he can just put his head on that. He doesn't have to have a full-length mirror. He can just do that from.
And they had quite a few of those kind of paintings where he's in the painting, so it's a painting by him, and he's in it himself.
Yeah. Any other questions? Let's see here. Tuning the winner, like picking winners in today's photography, absolutely. And the terrible thing is, if anybody's ever been a judge, I remember just judging art shows at William Patterson. It's a nightmare. I mean, people be saying, Maggie, come on, hurry up. We have to go. I'm like, I don't know if it should be this one or this one. They say, it was like, they were showing, there'd be like several thousand paintings they had to look at in 2 days. They'd make their judgments.
And it all depended on who the judge is and what he liked. Maybe
yes, and those would be judges who had won. Many of those judges had won there, so they would know, well, this is obviously what I did was a prize-winning sort of thing, so there should be more of what I did. This is very conservative, yeah. Except Corot and a few others, they would advocate for something new, but not very many did. And didn't those ornate thick frames detract? It was just taken for granted that that's the way they would be. It is with Impressionists for the first time. There are some plain white frames, or Mary Cassatt will do some that are in red or green, but because it would make it fit into the decor of the room where it would be placed. And
judges all do the judging before the crowds got in the
yes. So the crowd would come in knowing, oh, this is the prize winner. Yeah.
And of course, they were all mostly male judges, female judges.
Oh yeah,
right? Those days.
Absolutely. I mean, women couldn't even have a standard, legitimate, ordinary education yet.
And yet there were great female artists those years too.
Yeah. The cliche about the female artists, think back to even Artemisia Gentileschi, they tended to be from families where they were artists, so they could learn it in their home environment. Maybe it's partly genetic for them, but they would also see just how it was done, and they would have someone who could help. Anything more? Okay.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.